South Africa stands at a crossroads. The country's future is held hostage by leaders who cling to an ideology that has failed everywhere it's been tried. Why? Because communism is all they know. These political parties, masquerading as defenders of the people, are not leading South Africa forward. They are dragging it backward, into an economic abyss paved by their Soviet masters decades ago. But let's not just throw accusations. Let's expose the truth. The relationship between South Africa's black political movements and the Soviet Union is no conspiracy theory. It's well-documented history. From the 1950s onward, the Soviet Union funneled money, weapons, and ideological training to groups like the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, and Umkhonto we Sizwe. The USSR saw Africa as a key battleground in the Cold War, and South Africa was one of its biggest targets. Soviet training camps in places like Moscow, East Germany, and Angola churned out the foot soldiers of Marxist revolution. Names like Joe Slovo, Chris Hani, and even Jacob Zuma were not just freedom fighters. They were indoctrinated in the same communist ideology that wrecked Eastern Europe. This wasn't just about military tactics. These men were taught that the state must control the economy, that private ownership was the enemy, and that nationalization was the only path to fairness. And today, decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, they still preach these failed doctrines. Let's break down how these Soviet-trained leaders turned South Africa into a communist experiment. Land expropriation without compensation. The government pushes for mass land confiscation just like Mugabe did in Zimbabwe. We all know how that ended famine, economic collapse, and millions fleeing the country. State-controlled economy. Every communist regime promises economic equality, but in reality it delivers only poverty, except for the ruling elite. South Africa's state-owned enterprises are collapsing just like in the USSR. Eskom, Transnet, and SAA are failing, not because of apartheid, but because socialist policies always lead to corruption and inefficiency. Keeping people dependent. The ANC and its allies don't want people to be independent. They need them poor, desperate, and reliant on government handouts. Why? Because dependency means control. This is straight out of the Soviet playbook. Control the means of survival, and you control the people. If you think South Africa is an exception, look at the rest of Africa. Examples of failure. From Zimbabwe to Mozambique, the pattern is clear. Centralized control, economic mismanagement, and widespread corruption lead to poverty and despair. The promise of equality and prosperity under communist regimes has repeatedly turned into a nightmare of scarcity and oppression. Mozambique under Frelimo and Angola under the MPLA were Soviet-backed regimes that implemented communist policies after gaining independence. Unfortunately, this led to civil war, economic decline, and dictatorship. Zimbabwe, under Robert Mugabe, who was Soviet-trained, saw its economy destroyed through land seizures and hyperinflation. In Ethiopia, the Derg regime implemented Marxist policies, resulting in mass starvation and a military dictatorship that slaughtered its own people. And yet, despite all this evidence, South Africa's political leaders continue to walk the same path. If communism has failed in the USSR, in Africa, in Venezuela, in every country that tried it, why do South Africa's black political parties still push it? Why, after decades of watching poverty and collapse, do they persist? Because it's all they know. Because they were trained to believe in it like a religion. Because abandoning communism would mean admitting that they were wrong, and that their struggle wasn't about building a better future, but about seizing power. South Africa stands at a breaking point. If these parties continue down this road, the country will not survive. Land expropriation will destroy food production. State control will crush businesses. And when the economy collapses, they won't take responsibility. They'll do what communists always do: blame the Boers, blame the West, blame anything but themselves. The people of South Africa must wake up. The question isn't just whether these leaders will change. They won't. The real question is, will the people reject them before it's too late?